Brilliant. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of dyslexia and why the history of dyslexia is important, why understanding the history of dyslexia is important. Now, when I say the history of dyslexia, clearly I don't mean who was the first dyslexic person. We don't know that, we'll never know that. But what we do know is we do know the history of research into dyslexia, the history of scientific research and the political movement of dyslexia. Now, the political and scientific history of dyslexia started in the late 19th century. I think it was 1878. I've got some notes here. 1878. A German called Adolf Kussmaul introduced the word Wortblindheit, that is word blindness, into the language. He noticed that there were certain subjects he had who couldn't read. This was followed quite closely by the German physician Oswald Berkhan, who identified dyslexia as a specific condition. And finally, Rudolf Berlin introduced the word dyslexia into the vocabulary. Now, people were noticing that dyslexia was not a visual issue. They were noticing at this point that there was something neuro-untypical going on, neurodivergent going on. Now, dyslexia as a subject, as we now know it, was begun in the late 19th century by an Englishman called William Pringle Morgan. Now, I'm going to read out what William Pringle Morgan said. He'd noticed a couple of subjects of his, and he wrote specifically about one, a boy called Percy. And this is what he said. Percy F., a well-grown lad, aged 14, is the eldest son of intelligent parents, the second child of a family of 7. So, the idea of intelligent parents in these days meant that the chances are you were going to be intelligent and well-educated yourself. He goes on to say, he has always been a bright and intelligent boy, quick at games and in no way inferior to others of his age. His great difficulty has been, and is now, his inability to learn to read. This inability is so remarkable and so pronounced that I have no doubt it's due to some congenital defect. Now, a contemporary of his, a man called James Hinchelwood, also noted a couple of years later, a boy aged 10 years was brought to me by his father on January the 8th, 1900, to see the reason of his great difficulty in learning to read. The boy had been at school for 3 years and had got on well with every subject except reading. He was apparently a bright and in every respect an intelligent boy. It was soon evident, however, on careful examination, that the difficulty in learning to read was due not to any lowering of the visual acuity, but to some congenital deficiency in the visual memory of words. Well, okay. So we've known from the late 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th century that dyslexia is not a visual issue, that it's a congenital issue and it's a neurological issue. So we've known this for well over 100 years. It wasn't until about 1925 that Samuel T. Orton, the American, did some research about dyslexia and about how dyslexia is to do with the dominance of the brain. We don't believe his research quite so well now. However, when he got together with an American woman called Gillingham, the Orton-Gillingham method became very well known and is still used today. And so from 1925, we've known how to teach people with dyslexia. In 1949, there was a Frenchman who first did some research into the directionality of reading when we read. And then finally, the first reference to dyslexia is made in the British Parliament in 1962. Right, well, okay, so 1962, so from about 1876 to 1962, it's taken 100 years before dyslexia is even mentioned in Parliament. Now let's get into the 1970s. The 1970s are very interesting because it's what I would like to call the female decade of dyslexia, the women's decade of dyslexia, and that's really important for a very specific reason, and which you'll see. So, let me read from here. In the 1970s, let's talk about this. First of all, the Disabled Persons Act briefly mentions dyslexia in 1970. But in the same year, the English neurologist MacDonald Critchley publishes an influential book, The Dyslexic Child, showing dyslexia in a sympathetic light. However, there's a report in the early 70s called the Tizard Report, when the writer, the author, Tizard, questions whether dyslexia is a thing at all. Now, this did tremendous damage to the history of dyslexia research and the history of how we look at dyslexia. And so in the British Parliament, Tizard questioned whether dyslexia was a thing, whether it was real. This put dyslexia back, I'd say back to the 19th century, in my view. And it wasn't until the women got involved. So here is the name of some women. Helen Arkell. She'd been diagnosed by the Danish dyslexia pioneer Edith Norrie, and she set up probably the world's first specific dyslexia support centre. A lady called Beve Hornsby, the Grand Dame of Dyslexia, then sets up the dyslexia clinic at St Bart's Hospital in London. Sanjay Naidu publishes landmark research in the field. Margaret Newton forms the Language Development Unit at Aston University. Marion Welchman, who was once nicely called the needle in the thread of the dyslexia world. She is instrumental in forming the British Dyslexia Association, Britain's biggest dyslexia association. And then finally, Kathleen Hickey and Wendy Fisher set up the Dyslexia Institute. In the late 1970s, Daphne Hamilton Fairley sets up Fairley House, which is one of the few specialist dyslexia schools in the UK, and Baroness Mary Warnock in 1978 publishes the Warnock Report. Now, the Warnock Report on Special Educational Needs mentions dyslexia, but she was told by the British government, by the people in the education department, to put a cap on it. This is really, really dark stuff, so she was told not to really talk about it. Dyslexia isn't a thing. Now, 1979, a Chilean called Albert Marc Galaburda identified anatomical differences in the language center of the dyslexic brain. So by 1987, the first US state law, I think it was Kentucky, was passed mentioning dyslexia. And finally, after all this time, dyslexia was officially recognized by the British Parliament. 1987. That's 1876 to 1987. It's over 100 years it took dyslexia to be recognized as a thing. And in fact, there was a number of occasions, as with Baroness Mary Warnock, where it was basically suppressed. People didn't want to know about it. And when you hear people saying, oh, dyslexia is not real, it comes from here, it comes from that. Now, this is important for two reasons. The first thing is to say that we have to take a long view of this. We've known about dyslexia since the late 19th century, and it wasn't until the late 20th century that it became officially recognized in the British Parliament. Britain is a relatively liberal country with these issues, and it took over 100 years for us to recognize it. So we have to realize that all the work we do now and everything we do now in our businesses and in our schools and in our community centers, this will have an effect. The second thing to remember, and I don't want to make a specifically gender-specific point here, but when dyslexia is in the hands of men, it's very much in the hands of research, and it's very much an abstract, theoretical thing. As soon as women get hold of it, a lot of the women in the 1970s were discussing dyslexia because they were dyslexic or their children at school were dyslexic, and they wanted to do something about it. So dyslexia was brought down to ground level. Dyslexia was made something practical, and this is what moves it forward. So you can have 100 years of research by men, and then when women get hold of it, the 1970s and 1925 or so with Gillingham getting together with Samuel Orton, that's when it becomes important. So it's not about men and women, but what this is about is how practical we make our research into dyslexia. It's about how practical we make ourselves when we deal with people with dyslexia. On the one hand, sure, it's going to take a long time. But on the other hand, as long as we do what we do and make it practical, that's what helps. Okay? Thanks very much for listening. It's a really interesting subject. If you'd like to know more, comment, like, share, and we'll get into the conversation. Thanks a lot.